1774 and King Louis XV of France is dead, and his grandson Louis XVI succeeds him. France at this point was Europe's greatest power, something which they wished to continue. Keeping this position from other European powers was costly and led to a series of expensive wars which essentially bankrupted France. At the top of the French government sat the king, the clergy and the nobles, who together are known as the ancien regime. The ancien regime mostly didn't pay taxes, which meant financing France's position fell to everyone else, mostly the poor. This period also saw the height of the Enlightenment. Prominent French political philosophers such as Montesquieu, Rousseau and Voltaire were challenging the political status quo. One major aspect of this was the king's divine right to rule, which meant that the king was king because that was what God wanted, so therefore shut up and do what he says. Ideas that challenged divine right to rule came from Britain with its constitutional monarchy and from the newly formed United States, who had decided that kings really weren't that necessary. France's aid to the American Revolution had secured independence for the colonies and had struck a blow against France's great rival. This, however, was not a cheap blow and threw France into even greater economic hardship. Louis appointed a series of finance ministers to fix the country's tax woes, but all failed simply because they couldn't get the clergy or the nobility to pay taxes. The peasantry were now starting to get restless since these tax problems hit them the hardest. A harvest failure led to the price of bread skyrocketing and riots broke out. France was now in crisis, and so Louis called for the Assembly of the Estates General, which was a major legislative assembly which had not met for over 150 years. It represented the three great estates of France: the first estate, the clergy; the second estate, the nobility; and the third estate, everybody else. No solution could be found, so in order to speed things up, King Louis simply locked the third estate out, because they were the ones who wanted change. The third estate then gathered in a nearby tennis court where they swore to continue meeting until a new constitution was established. Unsurprisingly, King Louis opposed all of this, but the people were much more supportive and formed the National Guard to protect the third estate, now called the National Assembly, against violent retaliation. To do so, they famously stormed the Bastille to free prisoners, but mostly to get guns. The National Assembly, now called the National Constituent Assembly, issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which established the rights of the French people. What makes this so important is that these rights came from the people, not from the king or God. The bread situation did not improve, and as such more riots broke out. A rumour started that the royal family were hoarding food, and as such rioters, mostly women, marched on the palace of Versailles. After a standoff and some violence, the king and his Austrian wife, the disdained Marie Antoinette, agreed to return to Paris where they'd be closer to the people. The revolutionaries started to punish the clergy and the nobles. The church could no longer levy taxes, and the revolutionaries also introduced a non-religious calendar. Many nobles fled to neighbouring countries and had their lands and wealths confiscated. These revolutionaries should not be seen as unified, however. They had different ideas on what France should be. Most revolutionaries, such as the Marquis de Lafayette, wanted to keep the monarchy, but the Jacobins, led by a certain Maximilien Robespierre, wanted its complete abolition altogether. After 2 years back in the capital and with much less power, Louis decided to flee to the protection of his brother-in-law, Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II. The royal family were recognised on the way and sent back to Paris, where they were seen as enemies of the revolution. Which they were. Louis and his wife's close ties with Austria meant that the revolutionaries were becoming concerned with external threats. To make matters worse, the Austrians and Prussians issued the Declaration of Pillnitz, which gave their support to Louis against the revolution. This declaration was used as a pretext to war, although Robespierre opposed it, and in April 1792 France invaded the Austrian Netherlands, beginning the War of the First Coalition. This was a victory for France, with only Britain refusing to make peace. France annexed the Austrian Netherlands and invaded the Dutch Republic, which after a popular uprising became the Batavian Republic, one of France's sister republics, which were essentially puppet states. Shortly afterwards, a second coalition, this time with added Russia, would declare war on France, but again it was a French victory. Back in France, the revolution also cracked down on internal threats. In 1792 the king was deposed and a republic declared. He was later put on trial for treason and sentenced to death by one vote. Louis was beheaded by guillotine in January 1793 and Marie met the same fate shortly afterwards. Louis's death would be the first and the most famous phase of the revolution, the Reign of Terror. This was a period of mass suspicion where neighbour would accuse neighbour of betraying the revolution. Not seeming supportive enough was enough to have you arrested. The period also saw the execution of over 40,000 people, many by guillotine. Power at this point rested with the Committee for Public Safety, which was led by Robespierre. The terror became more and more paranoid until Robespierre himself was arrested and executed, but not before being shot in the face. After the fall of Robespierre, there was a period of stability when a new government, the Directory, was formed. This would last for 5 years before it was overthrown by a famous general, Napoleon Bonaparte, who was subsequently declared First Consul of France. Napoleon had risen to prominence due to his successful military career. He first defeated the British at Toulon before leading a successful invasion of Italy. He was not always successful though, as demonstrated by his 1798 invasion of Egypt, which was rebelling against rule by the Ottoman Empire. Napoleon wanted Egypt to act as a launch pad for invading British colonies in Asia, but harassment by Ottoman and British forces meant that he had to return home, achieving nothing. After his coup, Napoleon oversaw a series of domestic reforms. One of the greatest changes to the government was that the bureaucrats and military officers were now promoted based on merit, not birth. To ensure the loyalty of those promoted, Napoleon created the National Order of the Legion of Honor, which people were admitted into based upon good service. He also sought to undo some of the harm done to the church by the revolution by restoring some power to it, but ultimately it answered to him. Some of Napoleon's most important changes were to the military. The French army was composed of conscripts who were gathered using France's efficient bureaucracy. The French army saw its administration improved, specifically how orders were relayed. The army developed a more effective medical service able to stem the outbreak of epidemics, as well as a sophisticated supply chain which meant that the soldiers no longer had to live off the land as much. In 1804, Napoleon was declared the Emperor of the French, formally ending the First French Republic and beginning the First French Empire. The next year he had himself crowned the King of Italy, which would act as a catalyst for another coalition against France. This war, the War of the Third Coalition, was the first of the Napoleonic Wars and one of the most famous. Britain had been an enemy of France since forever, and Napoleon was keen to knock it out of the war. To do so, he amassed a huge army on France's northern coast, but for an invasion to happen, Napoleon had to neutralise Britain's greatest strength, the Royal Navy. Interestingly, in order to finance the war, Napoleon sold his North American territories to the United States. The United States borrowed some of this money from British banks, which meant that the British were essentially funding a French invasion of themselves. Any hope of invading Britain was ended when the French and their ally Spain's combined fleet was destroyed at the 1805 Battle of Trafalgar. Napoleon fared significantly better on land against the continental powers. The army waiting to invade Britain marched into the Holy Roman Empire, and after some clever manoeuvring managed to secure the surrender of an Austrian army with very little bloodshed before capturing Vienna. The remnants of the Austrian army joined up with the Russians under Emperor Alexander. Napoleon gave the impression that his army was in shambles, which made the Allies confident enough to meet him at the Battle of Austerlitz. Here, Napoleon won one of his greatest victories, securing an Austrian surrender. This victory also saw the end of the Holy Roman Empire, which was dissolved shortly afterwards, becoming the Confederation of the Rhine, another French puppet state. French dominance would upset the Prussians, who would shortly afterwards begin the War of the Fourth Coalition. Bad idea. French victory here saw the creation of a semi-independent Polish state called the Duchy of Warsaw, which was carved from Prussian territory. At this point, Napoleon had a firm grip over most of Europe, and he demanded that all those under his influence join the continental system, which was essentially a trade embargo aimed at bankrupting Britain. Portugal, Britain's closest ally, was reluctant to join, and so the French with their Spanish allies invaded in 1807, forcing the Portuguese royal family to flee to Brazil. Spain was undergoing its own problems, and sensing weakness, Napoleon invaded Spain itself and installed his brother Joseph on the throne. The British then landed in Portugal, where both nations teamed up with the Spanish rebels against the French, beginning the Peninsular War, which would last for 6 years. Simultaneously, the Austrians, undeterred by France never losing, began the War of the Fifth Coalition, which France shockingly won, giving them this territory. 3 years later, Russia was getting sick of being told what to do, and so started trading with Britain again. Napoleon's support for the neighbouring Duchy of Warsaw also made Tsar Alexander nervous of a possible French invasion. This fear was well founded, since in 1812 the French invaded Russia with a huge army numbering over 500,000. Napoleon won many costly victories and occupied Moscow. The Russians, however, had destroyed everything of value as they retreated, and when winter came around, Napoleon's army froze and starved, forcing him to retreat. Napoleon's failure in Russia led to the major powers of Europe, plus the now independent United Netherlands, forming a sixth coalition against the French. This time, the coalition managed to defeat Napoleon and occupied Paris. The Peninsular War also ended with an Allied victory, and Spain became an independent nation again. Napoleon then abdicated and was subsequently exiled to the island of Elba. Shortly afterwards, Louis XVI's brother, also called Louis because why rock the boat at this point, was crowned Louis XVIII, but unlike the previous monarchy, this one was bound by a constitution. Strangely, Napoleon was not happy with his exile and managed to escape Elba and return to France. Louis XVIII bravely ran away to Britain, and Napoleon resumed his position as emperor. The countries that had just defeated the French were none too happy about this, and so formed the Seventh Coalition. The coalition was victorious, and Napoleon suffered his most famous defeat here by a joint Prussian-British army at Waterloo, and shortly afterwards was exiled to St. Helena, off the coast of Africa, where he remained until his death in 1821. Afterwards, the main powers of Europe established the Act of Vienna, which removed France's conquests and tried to establish a balance of power in Europe. The idea was to prevent a single nation from becoming too powerful and to prevent future wars, which went swimmingly. The legacy of the French Revolution was a fundamentally different France whose republican ideals would never go away. It made Napoleon's rise to power and the subsequent wars possible, which saw France rise to its highest heights, but its downfall would leave Britain almost unchallenged for the next 100 years. I hope you enjoyed this video and thank you for watching.